Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Rough and Refined. I'm your host James. Today we're going to go through the 5 reasons why I love vintage watches. I'm going to start it off with a wristwatch check. I am wearing my vintage Hamilton Thin-O-Matic. It was given to me by my grandfather. I believe it's from around the late 50s, early 60s. Recently got it serviced, although the date wheel's not working again, but that's alright. I don't really use the date. But we're going to get into the 5 reasons why I love vintage watches, including this one. So the first reason why I love vintage watches is because it brings you back to a certain time, kind of a nostalgia for a certain time period. I know for me specifically, I really like watches that are from the 50s and 60s, since that's kind of how I was introduced to watches in general, was through watches from that time period from my grandfather. But it's just interesting to have nostalgia for a specific time period, maybe a period you like in history or something like that. Or maybe watches that are connected to a certain point in history, maybe World War II watches, World War I watches, something like that. Watches that were used for some particular purpose or for some historical significance. So that's definitely reason number 1, is nostalgia for a specific time period in history. So my second reason for loving vintage watches is the appreciation of the craftsmanship and the technology at the time the watch was created, and also the lack of planned obsolescence that's in many products today. That's something I like about watches in general, even contemporary, is that a watch brand considers itself effective or a good watch brand if you are going to keep the item for your whole life and hopefully pass it on to the next generation. In general, you know, the watch industry, at least the luxury watch industry, actually wants these watches to last a long time, and vintage watches are just a representation of that tradition and how these things are made to last, which is very rare in products that you find today that are, you know, very cheaply made, you know, sourced out to the cheapest bidder in terms of labor, and come with all their, you know, host of ethical and all different kinds of problems. So watches just remind me of like old things that are made well to last, before the craze of planned obsolescence, just making you buy more and more product. These things are made to be repaired. That's why we have watchmakers, and that's why they can, you know, they can even create and fabricate parts, if need be, for these things to continue to run. I'll try to put some B-roll in here of some movements. I think I can show one movement that I have from a Hamilton from the 1920s. That has like a pop-off case back, and you can see, you know, the hard work that really went into creating that item, and the fact that I can still wear it now in 2021 is just, you know, is another reason why I really love vintage watches. So the third reason why I really love vintage watches is the variety of styles and even the variety of brands that exist in vintage watches, before the quartz crisis especially. There's so many different brands that, you know, a lot of us have never heard of, that really just disappeared after the quartz crisis began, or shortly thereafter. So it's really interesting to look at vintage watches and see brands that just you don't see every day. And there were a lot more brands back then, a lot of brands all over the place, even in different, you know, regions in Switzerland, and even different places in Europe and other places. There's just so much more variety in vintage watches, in brands and styling. In terms of styling, I mean, they have some crazy lugs. I can try to, you know, look up some pictures of some different watches, but some crazy lug designs that look really beautiful that you just don't really see that are made today. Today, I'd say, you know, a lot of watches kind of mimic each other in certain ways, especially, you know, in certain segments like maybe the dress watch category, the gold dress watch category. Since it's not very popular today, a lot of them end up being very similar to each other in terms of case dimensions and general style. It's really nice to see kind of like the peak era of the dress watch in vintage watches, you know, means that you have so many different choices to choose from compared to today. So yeah, I really love that there are so many different options. I mean, there's so many brands, and even brands that you know already, like Hamilton. I like Hamilton, you know, contemporary, and I really like Hamilton vintage. Because they just made so many different things that if you just look at today, you know, you'd think, oh, you know, they make the Jazzmaster and the khaki field, and that's, you know, that's about it. But they made so much more. They made dress watches. I have 2 of their dress watches, and the Hamilton khaki field, which I already did a video on. But it just makes you appreciate the brand and its trajectory through time when you look at the vast offering that they may have used to have had in the past compared to now. So definitely I love vintage for variety. So the fourth reason why I love vintage watches so much is the fact that a lot of these vintage watches are handed down from family member to family member down a family line, and I really like that concept of passing something down. It's a high quality item that can still work for the next generation, but more importantly reminds the next generation of those who came before them. And usually it's tied to specific people. For me, it's tied to my grandfather and my grandmother as well, but mostly my grandfather, and him introducing watches to me and me thinking about when he acquired this watch or when he received this watch, what point in life was he in, and what was going on in the world around him at that time when he got this watch. Like, what were the news headlines like? What was his family like? What was my uncles and my mother, how old were they when he got this watch? Did they even exist at that time? It's just interesting to think, and it's something that can really connect you to the past and to family members. And even if you do not have a watch that's inherited from somebody, any vintage watch, has that connection to a previous generation or to a previous time, whether it be, the 1940s, the 50s, 60s, any time, it has a specific, time period that it lived in, and a time period where somebody went into the store and picked up that watch and wore it most likely for years to come, maybe the rest of their life, until, it got eventually into your hands, through other people. So I just love the history and that more personal touch that vintage watches have, thinking about why did this person choose this watch, what was going on in the world around them at that time, what kind of news did they hear wearing it? Like, did they hear about, the victory in Japan in World War II? Did they hear about the assassinations of JFK and MLK while they wore this watch? And, even if they don't realize that they wore it then, that history still exists in a small way tied to that event. So I always find that interesting to think about, when I'm looking at my vintage watches, is that connection to history and that connection to, a previous generation and what was important to that generation, versus mine. So the fifth reason why I love vintage watches is because of the price point. I mean, this is more of a practical reason why I like vintage watches, but, let's be honest, what you can get in vintage, oftentimes you can get a lot for your money. Especially with me, I know I really like, I'm trying to get into more solid gold or even gold-filled small dress watches. And, with the prices of gold today and how much of a premium that brands put on their gold watches, it's extremely cost prohibitive to buy any kind of solid gold watch. And I'm not the biggest fan of plated gold or, kind of like more of the cheaper, maybe Macy's brands that do like 24 karat, but it's like plated gold, and it just chips off really easily. I think it looks fine, it looks pretty good, but gold filled, at least you're getting a little more gold in there. That's a whole process in itself. Maybe a whole video of going over gold filled versus plated versus solid gold and all the different names that we have for putting gold on top of another metal. But yeah, you can get so much more for your money, especially when it comes to gold. And if you're willing to wear, what would today be considered pretty small watches, I love 34 millimeter watches. I even have a 32 millimeter watch in my collection, and it wears fine. If you're wearing it for you and not to impress, other people, then, you're not going to have too much of a problem wearing a really small or a big watch. You should wear it because you like it, but I would also experiment with different sizes, because in vintage, if you're willing to wear, a more traditional men's size of, 34, 36, 38 millimeter, there's just so many different watches open up to you at that point. So much of the market opens up instead of being limited to, 40 millimeter and larger watches, which there's nothing wrong with. It's just, if you can, if your palate can develop to, accept a wide variety of sizing, you can wear so many different types of watches from different time periods, and it just makes the hobby more enjoyable, at least for me. But yes, I love the ability to do all that with vintage watches. So there we are. Those are my 5 reasons why I love vintage watches. One more bonus reason why I love vintage watches is the community. The community of people who are really into vintage watches is amazing, in my opinion. I really like, talking to people online or, in the YouTube comments on videos about vintage watches, or even, when I am in a watch store or out, even in the supermarket, and I see somebody with a really nice, like, vintage watch, or really any watch. I like to, make it a point to, try to compliment them, where appropriate. And it's always nice to strike up a conversation with another vintage watch enthusiast, just because it's almost like a deeper level of enthusiasm, or deeper level in the hobby when you're getting into the nitty gritty of 1940s chronographs made by a particular brand. It's just a certain level of intensity and nerdiness that comes with really being in the vintage watch world that maybe sometimes you don't get with the contemporary watch world. So yeah, I really love the community of the vintage watch lovers. Yeah, so that's pretty much all we got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give me any feedback or anything you want to see, any topics discussed. I'm going to try to step away a little bit from the watch reviews of my my watch collection. I'm still going to sprinkle them in, here and there, but I'm going to try to put a lot of these types of videos where I'm just kind of discussing things about the watch community, about the watch market, a little bit more about myself, why I started collecting, and stuff like that. So if you guys could please like and subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're interested in this content, I'd really appreciate it. All right, see you next time.